Kola, good morning everyone, Richard here. Welcome back to the channel. Today we are looking at a new ultra wide angle lens from 7Artisans. It is the 9mm f5.6 lens for full frame mirrorless cameras. Now, first of all, 9mm full frame lens is ridiculously wide. In fact, 9mm is the widest focal length for a rectilinear lens for full frame cameras. But this 7Artisans 9mm f5.6 lens is not the first 9mm full frame lens. Laowa has released a 9mm f5.6 lens just a few years ago, and it was one of the craziest lenses that I have ever reviewed. And this time, this new 7Artisans 9mm lens has very similar specs. It is also f5.6 maximum aperture. It is a completely mechanical manual focus lens for full frame mirrorless cameras, but there are a few differences. First, the price of this lens is $479 US, or if you live in other countries, I have the retail price here as well. If you compare it with the Laowa 9mm lens, which is $599, it is about $120 cheaper. In terms of view angle, the official figure for this 7Artisans lens is 132 degrees, so it is slightly not as wide as the Laowa, which is 135 degrees. Here are two side-by-side photos shot with the 7Artisans and the Laowa for you to see the difference. But while the 7Artisans is slightly not as wide as the Laowa, it is still very wide. I would say still ridiculously wide. To give you some idea, here is a photo that I shot with a 18mm lens, and here is the photo that I shot with this 9mm lens. You can see the huge difference and how wide this 9mm lens is. The size of this lens is reasonably compact for a 9mm lens. Because of the extruded front element and the very wide field of view, the lens has no front filter thread. So if you really want to use filter with this lens, you will need to see if there are any aftermarket solution available. The body of this lens is pretty much all made of metal, including the lens cap, and I really like 7Artisans' signature black chrome lens mount. The lens feels very solid, but I won't call it heavy. Focus ring is pretty smooth, and the focus flow is only 90 degrees. Because of the very deep depth of field, even 90 degrees is not a problem at all. I imagine a lot of people would just rely on hyperfocal distance to set the approximate focal distance when they are shooting with this lens. Aperture ring has clicks, and it is one click per stop. Apart from this one extra click between f5.6 and f8, at first I didn't really know why there is this extra click between f5.6 and f8, but after using the lens for a while, I think I figured out the reason, and I'll tell you why in a minute. Let's have a look at the image sharpness now. If we look at the center of the image, at the maximum aperture f5.6, the center sharpness is already very good. So even when I stop down the lens, there isn't any real improvements in terms of center sharpness. And now if we look at the edge of the photo, at f5.6, the very edge of the photo is a little bit soft. Stopping down to f8 will improve a bit, and we'll reach the maximum edge sharpness at f11. But I think unless you really need excellent sharpness all the way to the very edge of the photo, you can shoot at f8 or even f5.6 and the overall sharpness is still very acceptable. The lens has a 5 aperture braid design, which suggests the lens designer isn't really trying to give us round bokeh balls when we stop down the lens. And that makes perfect sense. With the really wide 9mm focal length and its f5.6 maximum aperture, it's very hard to dissolve the background even when you are shooting close-up photos. Even some smartphone cameras can blur the background more than this 7Artisans lens when shooting close-up photos. Because of that, out-of-focus rendering is just not important at all for this lens. The minimum focus distance is 20 cm or about 8 inches. That sounds very close, but because of the very wide focal length, the maximum magnification ratio is not really that high. Here is a photo I shot at the minimum focus distance. Now, even though the maximum magnification ratio is not that high, but the image sharpness is really good even at f5.6. We'll now have a look at the vignetting performance. This is a test photo that I shot at f5.6. Light fall off near the corner is quite noticeable, a bit more than what I expected. Maybe it's because of the relatively small size of the lens. However, one thing that is very interesting is, even when I stop down the lens, the amount of vignetting doesn't really change much at all. If you compare the photo that I shot at f5.6 to f22, the amount of vignetting is very similar. This 7Artisans lens has excellent chromatic aberration control. I see virtually no color fringing at all when I go through all my real-world photos. So color fringing should not be a problem when you are shooting with this 7Artisans 9mm lens. This 9mm lens is a very wide lens, but it's not as wide as most of the fisheye lenses in the market. However, one big difference between this lens and the fisheye lenses is that this lens is a rectilinear lens, so the image captured is not highly distorted like fisheye lenses. I use the word highly distorted because this 9mm lens does still have a bit of barrel distortion. And it is quite noticeable when you have a straight line near the edge of the frame. Now, for some ultra wide angle lenses, the amount of distortion might change, depends on the focus distance, but with this lens, the distortion remains pretty much the same no matter I'm focusing at close distance, 0.2 meter or infinity or anywhere in between. And from this test footage, you can see that this lens only has a small amount of focus breathing. To be fair, the amount of distortion with this 7Artisans lens is still a lot less than some wide-angle lenses. A few wide-angle lenses around 20mm focal length that I've reviewed in the past have way more distortion than this lens, especially if I disable the lens profile correction for those lenses, which this 7Artisans lens doesn't have because it's a pure mechanical lens. For a lens that has a big extruded front element and the ultra wide field of view, the lens could suffer from lens flare very easily. Luckily, lens flare performance with this 7Artisans lens is much better than I expected. Yes, there could be a bit of lens flare when the sun or some strong light source is in front of the lens, but the amount of lens flare is almost always kept at very acceptable level. Even with this nighttime test shot, the result looks better than most lenses, and I was quite surprised by that. If you love Sunstars, it is very easy to create Sunstars with this 7Artisans 9mm lens. You just need to stop down the lens half a stop from f5.6 to f6.7 and you can already see some nice looking 10-point Sunstars in your photo. And I believe this is the reason why the aperture ring has a special click between f5.6 and f8. That is to allow you to create Sunstars without having to stop down the lens much at all. At f8, the tails of the Sunstars already become very sharp and very long, and when you further stop down the lens, the Sunstars actually doesn't look too different when compared to f8. So if you are someone like me who love 10-point Sunstars, you should be really happy with the Sunstars from this 7Artisans lens. In terms of image quality, this 7Artisans 9mm f5.6 lens is very decent. While there are a few things that it can improve, The weakest area is vignetting, and the fact that you cannot reduce vignetting by stopping down the lens. Fortunately, vignetting is the easiest thing to correct in post-processing. Build quality is the typical 7Artisans quality. It is not something that I would call premium, but it is solid and there's nothing that I would really complain about. Since the price of this lens is quite a bit cheaper than the Laowa 9mm f5.6 lens, it is an attractive choice for people who are interested in the Laowa but don't want to pay so much. Well, it's not significantly cheaper, but $100 is still $100 cheaper. The most important thing I want to tell you about this lens is really wide, ridiculously wide, and I've mentioned that a few times so far in this review. When I'm taking photos using this lens, quite often I find I have to walk a lot closer than I expected, and that really changed the composition of the photo. It could be really tricky sometimes because my brain is just not used to think and look at the world in such a wide angle. Even turning or tilting the camera just slightly would dramatically change how the image would look like. So you have to be really careful with the position and also the camera angle when you are shooting with this lens. But if you think you have the skills to accept the challenge, then you could capture some really unique photo with some crazy fun composition. So are you interested in getting this lens? Or you think it is really a little bit too extreme? Drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts.